Okay, why don't we get started now? Okay. So, good evening. Welcome to our local history program on the Mid-Hudson region and the American Revolution. My name is T.G. Wilmot. I am instructor of history in the Department of History, Government, and Economics here at Dutchess Community College. This evening we will be hearing from 4 speakers. Our speakers are from diverse backgrounds, but each has accomplished, I think, so much in researching and preserving the history of the Hudson Valley, particularly the history of the Revolutionary War era. Before we begin our journey into the 18th century, I would like to thank those who've made this evening's program possible. First, certainly our 4 speakers. Dr. James M. Johnson, who is Executive Director of the Hudson River Valley Institute, and the Dr. Frank T. Bumpus, a Chair in Hudson River Valley History at Dutchess Community College. Also, Mr. Rich Goering, who is the former Preservation Supervisor for the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. Miss Johanna Poor, who is Director of the Historical Society of Newburgh Bay and the Highlands. And finally, Mr. Lance Ashworth, the President of the Friends of the Fishkill Supply Depot. I would also like to thank the DCC community, in particular, Dr. D. David Conklin, the president of Dutchess Community College. I would like to thank the faculty and the staff of the Department of History, Government, and Economics, and also the many faculty members, administrators, and support staff who have contributed to organizing and promoting tonight's event. Finally, a special word of thanks to the members of the Friends of the Fishkill Supply Depot, in particular, Mrs. Judy Wolf, Mrs. Julie Mearsberger, and Mr. Matthew Villardo. In addition, special thanks to the staff of the Hudson River Valley Institute and to Mr. Edward Hughes of Marist College, all of whom who have made tonight's presentation possible. So thank you. Thank you. I'd like to thank you all very much. The format for our program will be as follows. Each of our speakers will deliver a short lecture, and after the last speaker is finished, I would like to invite all of our speakers back up on stage for a question and answer session. So if you do have questions, please hold all your questions to the end of the program. At the completion of the program, there will be a reception across the hall in the Ritz Lounge, to which you're all invited. The Friends of the Fishkill Supply Depot and the Hudson River Valley Institute will have tables at the reception if you would like more information on their organizations. And in addition, the Hudson River Valley Institute will have several of its publications for sale. They're already for sale right outside the door of the auditorium. Finally, I would like to ask that as we begin, everybody please silence your cell phones. Thank you. Our first speaker is Dr. James M. Johnson of Marist College and the Hudson River Valley Institute. Dr. Johnson is a retired colonel, U.S. Army, and a leading authority on the military aspects of the American Revolution. He is the author of numerous books and articles on the Revolution in the Hudson Valley area. The title of Dr. Johnson's talk, A Post of Great Importance, the Fishkill Supply Depot, and the Hudson River Valley. So let's welcome our first speaker, Dr. James Johnson.
going to put my glasses on to start, then I'll switch. You can see that they're very basic. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you tonight. Welcome to the Hudson River Valley. Welcome to the American Revolution. Welcome to the 18th century. I am Lieutenant James Johnston. I am the adjutant of the 5th New York Regiment as I stand before you tonight. General George Clinton wrote to the Council of Safety in June of 1777 that the Colonel Louis Du Bois wishes James Johnson, his present Sergeant Major, to fill that vacancy. Ensign is an exceeding good officer, a decent lad with good share of education, and in my opinion will merit the promotion to which as the first non-commissioned officer in the regiment he is in some measure entitled. So I stand before you and as a member of the 5th New York Regiment, you can tell that because of the brown uniform faced with blue, and this was one of the key Continental regiments that helped to defend the Hudson River Valley during the American Revolution, and it fought at Fort Montgomery and Fort Clinton on the 6th day of October 1777. And you'll hear a bit tonight about that battle and how that fit into the larger context of the war. So my charge is to set up the big picture. Why was the Hudson River Valley important here in New York? How did it contribute to the winning of the war? And then how do the places that we're going to talk about tonight fit into that larger construct of the Hudson River Valley? Now, I believe that the Hudson River Valley was the center of the war. They used a term back then called seat of the war. We call that theater of operations today, and I think it was the chief seat of the war. The British will be here in New York from July of 1776 until the 25th of November, 1783. And the Continental Army will generally spend time very close or in the Hudson River Valley. Washington will spend something like a third of the war either in or near the Hudson River Valley. So I will try and make a case as to how important the Hudson River Valley was. I'll put into the context then the Fishkill Supply Depot, because that's really what we're talking about tonight. We want you to understand how the Hudson River Valley fit together in the American Revolution, but we also want you to understand how important the Fishkill Supply Depot was, and we hope is and will be. So we're hoping, and you'll hear from Lance about that at the very end, what we're trying to do today to save the Fishkill Supply Depot. So the Hudson River Valley is the center of the war. If you think about the things that happened here, from battles to the beginnings of the country in terms of legal documents. Declaration of Independence is read from the steps of White Plains on the 9th of July, 1776. Constitution is formulated. Here in New York, the New York Constitution will then help to lead to the national Constitution. So political, economic, all kinds of things happen here in the Hudson River Valley. We even have our own Tea Party. We have members, patriots, Whigs who throw tea into the New York harbor, just like happened in the Boston Tea Party. And the interesting thing about New York, it's a civil war. You have Englishmen vying for the idea of who shall support the king. Those are the loyalists who decide to stay with the king, or who shall break away and support the idea of independence. So we end up with Whigs or patriots against loyalists who will then fight against each other here in the Hudson River Valley. So there will be all kinds of things that will happen here that I will then elaborate on in a little bit more detail to give you an idea as to why this is so important. There will be key battles here. White Plains will happen in October 1776, and of course the important battles of Saratoga in 1777, and as Johanna will tell you, the last encampment of the Continental Army, Washington's army, was at New Windsor and Newburgh, and that was at the end of the war, 1782-83. The French will be here in 1781. They will march through New York on their way to Yorktown, Virginia, and they will stay 6 weeks in Westchester County, Phillipsburg, now present-day Greenburgh, before Washington and Rochambeau, the French commander, will decide to go to Virginia, and that will end with the defeat of Lord Cornwallis, General Cornwallis, at the siege of Yorktown. This will also be a place that you will see a lot of battles take place. You'll see fortifications built. The Americans will start with Martelier's Rock, which we call Constitution Island across from West Point. That happens in the fall of 1775. General Charles Lee will begin to fortify New York in 1776 in the spring. The British will land in Staten Island end of June, early July of 1776. Battle of Long Island will take place there. It's now called the Battle of Brooklyn by most people. And so you're going to see that this is important to both armies. In fact, when the British leave here on the 25th day of November, 1783, they will be accompanied or preceded by some 35,000 loyalists who will leave New York to go to England, to Canada, to the Caribbean, and then essentially leave their homeland as they saw it in defeat to go to other places. New York was second only to New Jersey in the number of engagements fought. Now, if you count these things, and we could probably debate this, but New Jersey claims 238, and New York fought 228. And that's out of somebody's count of 1,331 skirmishes or battles that were actually fought in the American Revolution. You'll see that Washington will fight against Howe at White Plains. He'll check him. Gates will defeat with Arnold's help, and we could discuss that, how much help Gates got from Arnold. And that takes place on the 7th day of October, 1777, in the second battle at Saratoga. We'll capture a field army, 5,000 men. That will then bring the French and then ultimately the Spanish in as allies of the French. So for most of us, we would consider Saratoga's, the battles at Saratoga, to be the turning point of the American Revolution. Down here in the Hudson River Valley, we contribute to that campaign. Rich Goering will talk a little bit about the battles of Fort Montgomery and Fort Clinton down on Popolopan Creek near the present-day Bear Mountain Bridge. And that battle will contribute to the larger success of the Saratoga campaign. In fact, the casualties there will surpass those of the second day at Bemis Heights at Saratoga. 150 casualties, American casualties at Bemis Heights, 350 total casualties at the Twin Forts on the Popolopan. There'll also be a battle called Stony Point, where Mad Anthony Wayne will use troops without flints and powder in their muskets, only bayonets, in two of his columns to rout the British force under Colonel Johnston at Stony Point. So the final piece of this is George Washington will help to decide to put a fortification in the Hudson River Valley at West Point. West Point means it's the piece of land that juts into the Hudson on the west side of the river. He will be here during the French and Indian War. And Washington will see how important the Hudson River was when he was here. And when he's on a committee of the Continental Congress in May of 1775, he will say, we need to build fortifications in New York on the Hudson. And that will then be sold to the Continental Congress as well as then to the New York Provincial Congress. So we will end up having this as an anchor point from the fall of 1775 with what will be built at Constitution Fort or Fort Constitution. I'm sure all of you realize that's not the American Constitution because that's 1775, and the name shows that we're conflicted in 1775 about support of the king, King George III. Washington will say important things about the Hudson. In 76, he will say that the Hudson secures the free and only communication between the northern and southern colonies, which will be entirely cut off by their possessing it and give them the command of the Hudson River and an easy path. He wrote in September of 1776 to the President of the Continental Congress that the Hudson River was the key to the northern country. We have a book out there by that title I'll be happy to talk to you about afterwards. In March of 1777, he will warn the governor, Jonathan Trumbull of Connecticut, that the British mounted an expedition to seize control of the Hudson River. The command of the passages over the Hudson and the free navigation of it by the British would prove fatal to us. He will also convince the French that New York is very important. And ultimately, he will call Fortress West Point on the Hudson in New York the key of America. He will write that in his Sentiments on a Peace Establishment in 1783. As long as he's commander-in-chief, he will never lose sight of how strategically important the Hudson River is. Sir Henry Clinton grew up in New York as a boy, the British commander. And whether or not that made a great impression on him early, it definitely made an impression on him later because he thought that the Hudson was a very important object. And he will spend a lot of time trying to take important works in the Hudson as well as defeat George Washington. So let me just summarize here in 3 arguments about how this is so important, and then I will tell you a little bit about Fishkill Depot. So I think there are 3 things that you ought to think about. First, the Hudson River drew both armies. If you look at the amount of time that both the Continental Army and the British Army spent here in the Hudson River Valley, you will see that the commanders have decided that this is really a very important place to control because it will control the Hudson, it will cut off the other army, it will provide an avenue, much like an interstate highway today. And so both armies decide that it's really important. You'll also see, for example, that it is where all of these battles and engagements are held. And so this is a place that both armies feel they must control, the Hudson River Valley. So from south to north, Westchester, all the way up to Albany, all the way up to Fort Ticonderoga, the extension of the Hudson River Valley, this is really the important spot in the American Revolution. Now, let me give you a little bit of a picture of how the Fishkill Supply Depot figures into this larger context. First, this logistical complex for supplies, transportation, all kinds of maintenance facilities, blacksmith shops, and other things grew up near the village of Fishkill to our south. Luckily, I think in 1777, it's about 5 miles inland from its landing and the Continental Ferry and present-day Beacon. I think that was important because the British did not make the effort to go that far in 1777 to burn it, like the British did with Continental Village near Peekskill, West Point's fortification at Fort Constitution, Kingston, the capital. All those places get burned, but Fishkill survives. It was at the intersection of the Albany Post Road to Poughkeepsie from Peekskill and the road from Fishkill Landing to Danbury, Connecticut. It was an ideal site, therefore, for magazines, those are storage facilities, a distribution center for transportation by wagons, sloops, and boats, and a marshaling point. Beginning in the fall of 1776, the upper barracks, storehouses, magazines, and workshops built around Isaac Van Wyck's farm in Clove Valley and a hospital, and the lower barracks in Snow Valley enjoyed the protection of the highlands to the south. The pass between Ball Hill and Round Mountain was the only north-south avenue of approach available for commerce as well as the British. In November of 1776, with the assistance of Captain Jean-Louis Humbert, a French engineer in the Continental Army, Judge William Duer supervised the construction of the original buildings. The lower barracks, 3 miles south of Fishkill, designed to accommodate 2,000 men. There were at least 4 structures, 2 on each side of the road. Each was to have been made of 2 mud walls. Troops would occupy these barracks, huts, and 10 upper barracks near the Van Wyck House today to protect the New York Convention meeting in Fishkill from September 1776 until 1777. I would make the argument that that makes Fishkill the second or maybe third, if you count White Plains, capital of New York. Support the activities against local Tories by the Committee for Detecting and Defeating Conspiracies, and the logistical activities taking place in the smithies, the armory for weapons, storehouses, and stables. Washington would direct the New Hampshire militia under Colonel Thomas Tash and Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Welch, augmented by a troop of the Connecticut Light Horse, to report to Fishkill to help the Ulster County Rangers in the effort against the Tories. He would route Major Elisha Sheldon with the rest of the 5th Regiment of the Light Horse and 2 companies of that state's 1st Regiment militia through there to White Plains. In early 1778, Both General Alexander McDougall and Horatio Gates would supervise the construction of the works in the Highlands, including West Point, from their headquarters at Fishkill. In 1780, French Major General the Marquis de Chastellux made the strategic value of Fishkill Depot very clear. He said, "As for the position of Fishkill, that it was a post of great importance is evident from the campaign of 1777. It is clear that the plan of the English was to render themselves masters of the whole course of the North Hudson River, and thus to separate the eastern and western states. It was necessary there to secure a post on the river. West Point was made choice of as the most important to fortify, and Fishkill as the place best adopted to the establishment of the principal depot of provisions, ammunition. These two positions are connected together. I shall soon speak of West Point, but I shall remark here that Fishkill had all the qualities necessary for the place of a depot, for it is situated on the high road from Connecticut and near the North River, and is protected at the same time by a chain of inaccessible mountains which occupy a space of more than 20 miles between the Croton River and that of Fishkill." So here's a French Major General who's arguing that second only to West Point is the Fishkill Supply Depot, which is perfectly sited to do the job for which it was established. Here's the way Chastellux will describe what's there. This is on the morning of the 21st at 9 in the morning. Quartermaster takes him around to offer services, place 2 sentinels at the door, and then he calls upon him to drink tea and then go see the Fishkill Depot. So he sees the barracks, the magazines, the workhouses of the different workmen employed by the service of the Army. These barracks are wooden houses, well built, well covered, having garrets and even cellars. As for the barracks, or rather the little military town of Fishkill, such ample provision is made for everything which the service and discipline of the Army may require, that a provost and a prison are built there, surrounded by palisades. One gate only affords access to the enclosure, and before it is placed a guardhouse. So what you see here is this French general is describing a military complex that's very sophisticated, that has barracks for troops, work areas for people that are supporting the Army, and clearly he believes it is a very important place. So once again, the Hudson River was critical to the outcome of the American Revolution. Washington called it the key of America, and you're going to see that West Point will essentially anchor the major fortifications and complexes of the Hudson River throughout the war, and will protect against a direct attack against the Hudson River Valley once the chain is placed across the river on the 30th of April, 1778. So to conclude, the Hudson River Valley allowed us to have a very important post, and that post was Fishkill Supply Depot. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Our second speaker is Mr. Rich Goering. Before retiring in 2010, Mr. Goering spent nearly 40 years with the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, doing historical and archaeological research in the Hudson Valley. He was a manager at the Cralo State Historic Site in Rensselaer and the Senate House site in Kingston. The title of Mr. Goering's talk is Triumph Out of Tragedy, Kingston and Fort Montgomery in 1777. Mr. Goering?
I'm going to attempt to be pretty brief and to try to lay out for you some vision of what was happening in this Hudson Valley in 1777. We'll sort of throw up a skeleton, and then hopefully we'll have some extra time to deal with questions I'd just as soon hear from you as I'm sure you'd like to hear from me. From the Holocaust that befell our Native American sisters and brothers to the terror of 9/11, the Hudson Valley has witnessed time and again the horror of history. 1777 was a pivotal year, with events in the Hudson Valley determining the course of American history, and some would even argue the history of the world as a result. The British campaign of 1777 came very close to succeeding. This was not a slam dunk win or lose on the part of Burgoyne or the Americans. This was very much a very close contest. Burgoyne brought his army, supplies, and his entire artillery train across the Atlantic to America, then up past Nova Scotia, down the St. Lawrence to Montreal, then south to Lake Champlain, Lake George, the upper Hudson, and on to Saratoga, only 25 miles away from Burgoyne's destination of Albany. After advancing over 4,000 miles, the outcome was uncertain, and it could well have gone either way. The American Revolution was a conflict of ideas, of fragile words put down on paper and passed from one person to another. As words spread throughout the colonies, and Americans, rebels to some, patriots to others, depending on your loyalties and viewpoint. But as Americans tried to unite and coordinate their efforts, they were hindered by geography and the slow pace of communication. Words could travel not at the speed of lightning that we expect today. An idea on a fragile leaf of paper traveled no faster than a rider on a galloping horse, or at best, at the speed of wind in a canvas sail. Whoever controlled the Hudson would control the flow of ideas and intelligence, as well as the placement of men, weapons, and supplies. To control the river and maintain communications, American troops, militia, and engineers began a hugely ambitious series of fortifications concentrating at Forts Montgomery and Clinton. They emplaced more than 50 pieces of artillery and deployed a massive iron chain and floated it across the river to prevent passage of any British ships. This was, of course, the first chain across the river. As Jim mentioned, in 1778, the Americans thinking, well, the idea almost worked at Fort Montgomery. They decided to build another larger, stronger chain and to fortify West Point. But in 1777, all of their efforts at fortification revolved principally around Fort Montgomery and Clinton. The Declaration of Independence threw off the government from England, but it left all of the newly declared free states without any governments. Each had to design and implement a government and a constitutional framework that it would work under. While New Yorkers prepared to take a stand at Fort Montgomery, their Provincial Congress was on the run, along with members who were attempting to draft a constitution for the new state. Starting in Manhattan, as rebels suffered a series of defeats, as Jim alluded to, the committee fled north, first to Harlem, then to White Plains, then to Fishkill. At Fishkill, they found a raging smallpox epidemic and a housing shortage. They considered meeting in one of the Fishkill churches, but found it to be so covered with the dung of pigeons and other fowl as to be unfit for their needs. So they used that building instead as a hospital for the troops. The committee then fled further north to Kingston. Kingston was a larger and more secure settlement, actually the third largest city in New York. By April 20th, 1777, the committee had produced a workable constitution, and they began to select and assemble its officials, senators, assemblymen, judges, the governor, lieutenant governor, and all of the other ancillaries. But on October 6, 1777, the British attacked and seized Forts Montgomery and Clinton. With the loss of the two forts and the chain, the entire Hudson was in peril. British ships sailed north, burning houses and shipping at will. Residents and government officials fled for their lives. If captured, anyone associated with this rebellious government could have been executed for treason. The British intended to suppress this rebellion, and the American casualties at Fort Montgomery showed how serious the British were. On October 16th, 1777, the British fleet sailed further up the river and came to anchor off Kingston. At Kingston, their ships were fired upon from artillery emplacements and from gunboats in the Rondout Creek. Referring to Kingston as a nursery for almost every villain in the country, General Vaughan ordered the city burned. In his reports, he and other officers boast of destroying every house except one. Captain Wallace also reported that the British attacked and seized the rebel batteries and the gunboats, and that in destroying the stores and powder, one Lieutenant Clark, with 2 or 3 others, was blown up, but we flatter ourselves, not injured badly. These apparently were the only casualties of the day in the attack on Kingston. Other English officers claimed to have burned 300 houses with an equal number of barns and stores. Actual loss appears to be 115 houses plus about 260 outbuildings. This figure comes from a document that was prepared. Robert Livingston, whose own estates and houses and outbuildings and mills at Claremont were burned by the same force, made the very generous offer of offering 50 acres of land in the Hardenburg tract to anyone who lost their house in the burning of Kingston. So there was a real incentive to get the list right, and that list lists specifically the names of individuals whose houses were burned and totals at 115 dwellings. But imagine for a moment the headlines that would accrue today from such an event. British destroy third largest city in New York. Hundreds of buildings burned to the ground. Stores of food and clothing destroyed. Sailing ships captured or destroyed. Prospects bleak for coming winter. War and liberty seem lost. This was viewed by the Americans as an act of terror, an attack upon a civilian population center. And the Americans got a lot of mileage out of that, and that seemed to have been a growing thread. It kind of convinced a lot of people who were sitting on the fence that maybe supporting the British wouldn't be such a good idea. The losses at Fort Montgomery and Clinton were far greater, with nearly 100 rebels killed and another 250 captured, while the British lost 40 killed and 150 wounded. News of events on the Hudson spread in every direction. As far away as South Carolina, the loss of Kingston served to unite citizens. In Charleston, funds were raised and sent to help relieve the suffering citizens of Kingston. But news also arrived of Burgoyne's surrender, occurring just as Kingston was being burned. Ironically, the attacks made by the British, intending to divide the colonies, ultimately helped to unite them. I often wonder what made Americans risk or even outright lose all that they had. We look to their writings, to what words and ideas they left for us, and we look at objects they left behind, often searching in vain. They tend to be pretty mute witnesses to events. But at Fort Montgomery, archaeological excavations showed evidence, as we would expect, of construction and the eventual destruction of the forts. There's ample evidence of the battle that was fought. But among thousands of artifacts recovered, one tiny, fragile piece of glass stands out. Only half an inch in size. It would have formed part of a cufflink, but with the word liberty clearly impressed in this tiny piece of glass. This fragile little object was lost at Fort Montgomery, neglected through time, and almost forgotten until it came to light nearly 200 years later. It was at places like Fort Montgomery that the fragile seeds of liberty were planted. It was in places like Kingston that ideas were nurtured, discussed, committed to paper to be shared, preserved, amended, and improved through the ensuing years. And in places like Fishkill and Fort Montgomery, patriots rest uneasily in shallow, unmarked graves, anxious for our efforts to protect their remains and to tell their stories and to take our turn at keeping liberty alive. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Goering. Our next speaker is Miss Johanna Poor. Ms. Poor has been director of the Historical Society of Newburgh Bay and the Highlands since 2012. She is an expert not only in history, but also in architecture, and her efforts to save the Newburgh Historic District were recently featured in the magazine of the National Trust and Historic Preservation. The title of her talk is Uncertain Peace, the Newburgh Conspiracy in Washington's Writings. Ms. Poor.
Just going to get a PowerPoint going. Thank you for having me. I'm going to speak a little bit more specifically. We've already sort of set up the broad terms. The Battle of Yorktown, of course, is October of 1781, and then many people don't realize that there's 2 years afterwards where there's a lot of uncertainty before peace is totally declared and the British evacuate in November of 1783. So I'm going to focus in on one little segment of time when Washington was in Newburgh, New York. So here's the Hasbrouck House. Washington arrived in April of 1782. He's there through that year into the next winter. And in doing research I worked at Washington's headquarters for many years. So in doing research there, it always struck me that you could take one specific day, January 10th of 1783, and you could look at just that moment in time and see really how desperate Washington was in that moment. So in January 10th of 1783, Washington wrote 2 letters. The first was to John Armstrong Sr. John Armstrong Sr. was in Philadelphia, and he was a former member of Congress. He had known Washington all the way back during the French and Indian War. And Washington writes this letter to him saying essentially that he's feeling totally alone, that he realizes that peace is not he doesn't know what's going to happen with the war. And you can see here, the army as usual were without pay and a great part of the soldiery without shirts. So he's realizing that they're in this moment of disarray. They don't know what, sorry, I messed up. Okay. The second letter that he writes is to one of his friends, Lieutenant Colonel Tench Tillman, who had been an aide-de-camp to Washington. And he writes this a little bit more personal letter about how the states are, Okay, so going back in time, the Battle of Yorktown takes place in 1781, but it's 15 months from when Washington, I'm so sorry, I'm just like nervous about it. Sorry. All right. So I'll go back to my notes. It's a popular misconception that the Revolutionary War ended on October 19th of 1781. But at this point, the French still remain in the continent. They move up to Philadelphia with Washington and eventually make their way to Verplancks Point, where, I'm sorry. I just can't, I'm sorry, I just can't do it.
Why don't you just use your slides?
All right, I'm sorry. So I've got a couple of examples of the discontentment that's happening in the ranks the year before. Washington is dealing with the grievances of the men, and a lot of people don't understand that when Colonel Louis Nicola was writing to Washington, they'd call, I'm sorry, I just can't even. Yeah, you want to come up and do it? So, sorry, Nicole and I spent the week preparing this talk, so let her take over for me.
Hello, everyone. My name is Nicole Shelley. And I helped Johanna put this presentation together, so I'll just continue on where we left off. So as you can see, a lot of here you have Washington. You have an uncertainty of peace, you have the negotiations, you have the conditional articles of peace being signed in November of '82, but it's still not certain whether it'll be approved, and so you have this sort of suspension of we're looking to terminate the war, but however, we still have to worry about enlistments. Are we going to continue? Are we going to have one more campaign? We still have to worry about future battles. How are we going to pay the soldiers? The money to pay the Continental Army comes from the federal government, which was under the Articles of Confederation at this time. However, the Confederation Congress did not have any authority to get their own money. They had to rely on the states. They had to ask the states to receive money. So we have this conflict where the Army hasn't been paid in a long time. And we'll see why this leads into discontentment among the officers and what led to what today we call the Newburgh Conspiracy. So these are several examples of both officers saying why they're so frustrated. They've been fighting for many years, many of them without pay, as you saw in Washington's letters, very poor conditions for the soldiers. Terrible weather, uncertainty of whether they'll receive any benefits as promised by Congress. So because this is such a big issue, and we only have 20 minutes, we're going to look at this at one perspective. Alexander Hamilton used to be an aide-de-camp, so he had worked very closely with George Washington for 4 years. They worked side by side. In fact, 50% of George Washington's war correspondence was written in Alexander Hamilton's hand. So they both had a very close relationship. Hamilton had gone off, he had fought in the Battle of Yorktown, but then he turned and he went into the political side. So then he joined, and he was a member of Congress at this time. And he writes a letter to Washington, their first letter in a year, where Hamilton basically wants to warn Washington of the financial situation of Congress. They're having problems with figuring out how they're going to pay for the soldiers. And also he's hearing, because he has been in the Army, he's hearing these stories of discontent, and they don't know what this might lead to. So on February 13th, Hamilton writes this letter. I'll just go through a brief timeline first, and then we'll go a little bit more in depth with some of the important letters here. March 4th, George Washington responds and says, basically he agrees with a lot of what Hamilton said. However, he doesn't believe that the Army will exceed the bounds of reason and moderation. So he agrees there's a lot of discontentment, but he doesn't think it will boil over. Then on March 8th, the Pennsylvania Colonel Walter Stewart arrives to the New Windsor Cantonment, and he starts spreading the story to his friends. He's coming from Philadelphia. He starts spreading the story to his friends that they're not going to get paid before Congress dismisses them and sends them back home. So this starts to create a lot of uproar. 2 days later, on March 10th, there is an anonymous address to officers that's circulated, and it's calling for the officers to come together in a meeting the next day and discuss what we need to demand of Congress. So at the time, this was a very big deal. There were possibly rumors of mutiny, whether this would lead to as far as marching on Congress in Philadelphia, the military taking up arms and going against the government. It could have spiraled into a lot of different things. So on that same day, March 11th, when the meeting was supposed to be held, Washington issues a general orders canceling the meeting, expressing his disapproval of this, and then he reschedules his own officers' meeting for March 15th, so it's on his own terms. The next day, a second anonymous letter appears as a response and saying, well, obviously Washington approves of what we want to achieve here because he's holding a meeting. So on this same day, very significant, Congress receives the official text of the Provisional Articles of Peace. So again, if the war is going to be over, we don't need the troops, they're going to be dismissed, well, they want to get their money first. So on this day, Washington writes a letter to Hamilton about everything that has occurred and how he's responded. So I'll get more into that right now. And then, of course, March 15th was when the officers met, and we'll also talk about Washington's Newburgh Address. The state of finances was perhaps never more critical. This is the very first letter that Hamilton wrote to Washington. And then he goes on to say that if we don't take any proper measures, which is very probable, within a few months, it may open an embarrassing scene. Keep in mind that it was a month later that the Newburgh conspiracy took place. He also goes on to say that if this happens, that George Washington has to help guide the torrent, to lead it in a positive place and not let this erupt or happen in unsanctioned terms. So in Washington's response, his letter in response, he says that if this happens, if such discontentment boils over, that it would be productive of civil commotions and end in blood. And goes on to say a lot of agreeing with a lot of the sentiments of Hamilton. And then this is a very poignant point. The sufferings of a complaining army on one hand, and the inability of Congress and tardiness of the states, who the Congress depended on for money, are the forebodings of evil. Remember, at this time, Washington didn't believe that anything would really happen. And it all came down to the issue of paying the army. Hamilton says that he believes, and many in the army believes, that if they're dismissed without their money, then they might not have a way of asking for it later on. They might just have to accept their fate of having served their country for all these years in terrible conditions and never being paid for it. So here's the letter. Remember, on March 10th, you had the letter, the anonymous letter calling for summons of a meeting. 2 days later, George Washington writes to Alexander Hamilton explaining everything that's been going on. Hamilton's his contact in Congress here. And he sends Congress 3 letters. He sends them a copy of the notification. He sends them a copy of this address that was circulated. And he also sends Washington's orders of the 11th to say, this is what I've been doing in response to this situation. And he says there's something very mysterious in this business. And so he said I was basically obliged to take action on this, and he was worried that the foot that stood wavering on a tremendous precipice of what would happen if this was not handled in the proper way. And then he writes to Hamilton saying, "Let me beseech you, therefore, my good sir, to urge this matter earnestly in Congress, that we need action in Congress." So then this brings us to the meeting, which Washington poetically planned for the Ides of March, March 15th. So although it was anonymous, a lot of scholarship has been done, and they believe that it was written by John Armstrong Jr. Remember that the letter from January 10th that Washington wrote was to John Armstrong Sr., his father. John Armstrong Jr. was an aide-de-camp to Horatio Gates, who was the hero of the Battle of Saratoga. He received a lot of credit for that. And so it was believed that he wrote this letter, and it called for a meeting of Congress of officers from the Army who were stationed at New Windsor Cantonment at this time, right next to Newburgh, to address their grievances. So here's just one part of the letter. You can see that he wanted to be represented what has been promised by Congress and what has been performed, this disparity between what has been spoken and what's been achieved, how long they've been waiting, and how much they've done for their country. So on March 15th, in the new building, or what we call the Temple of Virtue, this is at the New Windsor Cantonment, you can visit it today, and this is a reconstruction. There was a meeting held of an officer from every regiment came together, and Washington said that whoever was the presiding officer, the highest ranked officer, would be in charge of this meeting. And then in the middle of meeting, Washington shows up. And the meeting was called to hear a proposal from Congress, and Washington comes in and he delivers what is called his Newburgh Address, basically saying that we need a little more patience and a little more faith in Congress, that we're working with Congress to have these issues addressed, that the Army will not be dismissed without receiving pay. And the big folklore of this speech is that he, at the moment when he wanted to read this address, he took out his spectacles, which hardly anyone had ever seen him wear, and he puts them on his nose and he says, I'm paraphrasing, but he says, I'm sorry for my service to this country for these many years have made my eyes dim. And this really moved the officers, and they sort of just gave them a lot of humility, and they realized that Washington was one of them. He had fought alongside them. He'd been working with them through all of the war, and so that here was this great counselor. They needed to listen to it and work in it. And so during this, the production of this meeting was to present resolutions to Congress that were then sent. So keeping in mind that we're formatting the Newburgh conspiracy in the dialogue of Hamilton and Washington's correspondence, let's bring it back to that. They continue their correspondence on this throughout all of April. So it goes on. This isn't just a one-time thing. They're dealing with a lot of different things. Congress forms a special committee to read the correspondence and the resolutions that were passed in this March 15th meeting. And Hamilton writes an official letter to George Washington on behalf of Congress. And it's quite interesting because he states that he sends two letters. So in the official letter, they say, oh, we've passed these resolutions, that the Congress will do everything in their power and will continue doing what was within their power to pay the troops before they're dismissed. And then Hamilton, along with that, sends a private letter expressing his frustration over Congress and their lack of action, and really the frustration at the structure that the Congress doesn't have the constitutional power to obtain the money needed to pay the troops. So they then get into this discussion of the weakness of the present Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, and they begin to engage in this dialogue, what needs to happen with the end of war. So in this correspondence, Hamilton lets Washington know that yes, the Articles for Peace have been passed. So this controversy really brings us from the end of the war into what happens next for our country, and that all happened here in the Hudson Valley. So feel free to visit us, and I really encourage you, if you want to learn more about this, it's such a fascinating correspondence between Washington and Hamilton, and I urge you to visit allthingshamilton.com, and you can see all of that correspondence for yourself. It's some really incredible poetic and beautiful writing.
Just to take over for you. So just to bring it back to a preservation message, I want to mention that Washington's headquarters in Newburgh is the first in the nation. So in 1845, a group of people in the city of Newburgh got together and they formed the Newburgh Historical Society, and they spent about 5 years trying to be advocates for the Hasbrouck House to be preserved. So in 1850, they were successful. They got the attention of the governor. His name was Hamilton Fish, and he purchased the property on behalf of the state of New York, opened it to the public, establishing the precedent for historic house museums in the nation and in the world. It's actually the first time that a home was opened as a relic, as a location, rather than the salon-style museums of old Europe. So Washington's headquarters in Newburgh in the Hudson Valley creates this precedent of preservation. The group that originally had been advocating for this becomes eventually, in 1884, the Historical Society of Newburgh Bay in the Highlands. So our group that we are today, out of the Crawford House Museum, which is a 19th century, 1830 home, we started that way. We're the very first activist historical organization. So we've now, in today's day and age, formed a lot of partnerships with new organizations like the Alexander Hamilton Awareness Society, which is only a few years old. And then, of course, we're here to talk about the Fishkill Supply Depot, which is another recent partnership that we need to be fostering. But I think it's really important to have that message as well, that here in the Hudson Valley, we're not just doing preservation now, but we've been doing the preservation work that's set the pace for the rest of the country.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Our last speaker tonight is Mr. Lance Ashworth, and in many ways he's tying together a lot of the themes that we've talked about. Mr. Ashworth has been president of the Friends of the Fishkill Supply Depot for almost 4 years, and in that time he has made outstanding efforts to increase awareness of this amazing yet tragically neglected historic site. The title of Mr. Ashworth's presentation is Crisis in Fishkill, Saving a Revolutionary War Burial Ground. Mr. Ashworth.
Good evening, everyone. I appreciate you attending this lecture and sticking with us all the way past 8 o'clock. It's a treat for me to be able to speak tonight and see this come to, see the symposium come to life. Our group, which is a preservation group, has had a partnership with Dutchess Community College for the past 2 years. I'm going to talk a little bit about that later, but that partnership has blossomed to the point where, in working with Todd, we came up with the idea to sponsor a symposium that would bring to life the rich Revolutionary War history of the Hudson Valley, as well as the issue that our group, the Preservation Group, is working on. So I sincerely appreciate your attendance. Now, I'm very different from each of the preceding speakers, and it's not because I've lost my hair or because I'm so good looking. It's because I'm not a historian, I'm a preservationist. And so if there are things in my talk that aren't accurate, please let me know afterwards, because the more that I hear about the true history of the Hudson Valley and the things, let's say, the small inaccuracies that I've talked about, I feel enriched when I'm set on the right course. As Todd mentioned, I'm going to speak about the Fishkill Supply Depot. Colonel Johnson talked about it and its place in the Revolution. I'm going to talk about what our group is doing to preserve the supply depot, and in order to do that, I'd like to give you just a brief history of its existence, because even locals down in Fishkill don't realize there's such a rich treasure of a site located down there. So, as Colonel Johnson pointed out, dating back to the Revolution, Fishkill was selected as the site of the principal supply depot or principal supply stores of the Revolution. And to complement what he said in terms of the reasons that it was selected, I think I would add that, New York was centrally located at the time of the inception of the supply depot. You had forces up in Massachusetts, forces in New Jersey, and when I try to put myself in Washington's shoes, I think to myself, well, what a better location to pick than Fishkill, which is central to the Revolutionary War effort and has great access to the Hudson River for the movement of supplies. Here we have an early map by cartographer Robert Erskine. Hopefully you can see there at the kind of the center top the words Fishkill. It corresponds really to the village of Fishkill, and then the buildings to the south along the road that runs through the middle of the map. That is the Albany Post Road. It's the same road that's US 9 today that you can pick up in Times Square and take all the way to Albany. So it was the principal overland supply route. So based on the records that we reviewed, the original supply depot encompassed around 72 acres. And as was described earlier, it really was a compact military city that had a logistical and supply function. So you can't really pick up a history book and read about Fishkill and its place in the Revolution, I think mainly because no battles or skirmishes took place there. And the supply and logistical functions of the Revolution were rather inglorious. And so our group suffers from not having a lot of historical accounts that we can refer to when we go to talk to stakeholders in terms of saving this site. This map is a compilation map, and for those of you who are familiar with Fishkill, the location of the supply depot, if we were to recreate it today, would be immediately south of Interstate 84 at its intersection with Route 9. So the Van Wyck Homestead, which I think is coming up in one of the slides, it was the headquarters, the officers' headquarters for that military base during the Revolution. Today, the site is presently occupied by a Home Depot, a McDonald's, a Citizens Bank. There's a Mexican restaurant in that area, as well as a Hess gas station. Nevertheless, there are significant acres of the original depot that are untouched that we'll talk about. Now, imagine this, with a static military base during the Revolution, which was rare for that time. Its duration was approximately 7.5 years. Estimates range anywhere between 4,000 and 6,000 troops were stationed in Fishkill during those 7 years. When you combine the disease, the smallpox, the wounded soldiers that were carted to Fishkill from battles like White Plains and Monmouth, there was a lot of death that occurred at the site. And so over time, as a byproduct of all those soldiers passing away, there arose a burial ground on the site of the Fishkill Supply Depot that still exists today. Now, after the war, after 1783, when the troops were sent home, the United States, the young United States, was tired of war. There wasn't even a standing army. And so the base that was the Fishkill Supply Depot was largely either abandoned and neglected, or was torn down and the wood was reused, the lumber was reused to build houses in the village of Fishkill. In fact, there are a couple examples of houses in the village today that were built with the lumber of the barracks of the Fishkill Supply Depot. Approximately 100 years after the war, as a part of the nationwide campaign to commemorate the final resting places of all the first patriots, the Daughters of the American Revolution placed markers at these sites, including in Fishkill. And so here we have a wonderful picture of the original marker in its original place shortly after the monument was erected. Here you see the marker to the bottom right. This vantage of this picture is as if we are standing on Route 9 and we're looking eastward. So to our backs would be the McDonald's and the Home Depot. To our front would be really a field that's grown over with trees, and to our immediate right front would be the Maya Cafe. Okay? That stone wall you see in the background, we believe, corresponds to Van Wyck Lake Road, if you're familiar with that area. In the early 1960s, just prior to the advent of the interstate highway, was the original grassroots effort to save portions of the original military base. Now, for those of you who are Dutchess County natives or who have spent a significant amount of time here, I'm sure you're well aware that up until, let's say, the 60s or 70s, Fishkill was really a sleepy upstate village. Not much had changed since the Revolution. I think the Dutchess Mall site was a big game changer in terms of development in that area. But in the 1960s, before the interstate was put in, local citizens banded together to make an initial study, an archaeological examination, and a preservation effort with regard to the Fishkill Supply Depot. The Van Wyck Homestead Museum, which is still today and really rests as the only remaining tangible, touchable portion of the military base from the Revolution, was saved as a byproduct of that early grassroots effort. So all the way until 1976, the DAR marker that I showed in the prior slide was sitting next to the Fishkill Supply Depot Continental Soldiers Burial Ground in Fishkill. And that location is at the intersection of Van Wyck Lake Road and Route 9 near the Maya Cafe. In 1976, however, things changed. The marker had been struck by some vehicles over time, and the Department of Transportation, largely in response to the new vehicular traffic that was feeding the Duchess Mall site, decided to expand the roadway and widen it. And with the consent of the DAR, the marker that marked the burial ground was relocated about 3/10 of a mile north to the Van Wyck Homestead Museum, which is where it is today. So you can visit that site and you can see the marker that was depicted in the photo previously. That singular event, though, at least in my estimation, really precipitated the precise location of the burial ground being lost. Trees grew over the site in the ensuing decades. It sort of got lost in the shuffle of development. Fast forward to 2006. Now, by this time, a pair of out-of-town owners had bought essentially the undeveloped land between the Van Wyck Homestead and the old Moogs Farm, which is the Maya Cafe. So that 10.5 acres, which is largely untouched since the Revolution, was purchased by two gentlemen who really had no local buy-in in terms of development or protection of the site, I should say, and who I think generally were unaware that in the 1970s the site had been put on the National Register of Historic Places. As a result of that lack of knowledge, in 2006, the owners put together a commercial development plan for the 10.5 acres that included the burial ground, as well as other ruins from the Revolution, like the officers' stables. And this is the development plan as it looked back then. Now, this event, the 2006 submission of the plan to the town of Fishkill, caused members of the Fishkill Historical Society to say, hey, hold on a second, we think that in that area there had been a burial ground at one time. Now, Rich and others will attest that, you know, from the 1960s all the way up until the mid-1980s, there had been a number of archaeological examinations done in that area to study the Fishkill Supply Depot, principally by Temple University in 1972. But none of those archaeological examinations rediscovered the burial ground. And so when this plan was submitted in 2006, in the eyes of the pro-development leadership of the town of Fishkill, it didn't seem like there was any conflict. If but for those early founders of our group who came from the Fishkill Historical Society, things might be different. So the early founders of our group, our preservation group, were so good at causing a clamor in Fishkill over the issue of whether there was a burial ground, that it resulted in the New York State Office of Historic Preservation stepping in and getting involved and ordering an additional archaeological examination of the area that was to be developed by the landowners. The difference in 2007 as compared to other archaeological digs is that at this time ground penetrating radar was available. So initially the team of archaeologists used conventional methods to do their examinations. When using a backhoe, they found some anomalies. They stopped with the backhoe, they got out their pickaxes and their other tools and went down and basically hand dug and did examinations. And initially they found 7 grave shafts basically at the vicinity of Van Wyck Lake Road and US Route 9. After identifying the 7 graves, including digging down as far as bones to 2 of the graves, the archaeological team brought in the ground penetrating radar. And of the entire 10.5 acre site that was to be the subject of development, they had enough money, enough funding to use the ground penetrating radar over approximately 4/10 of an acre. And in that 4/10 of an acre, 320 blips on the radar report corresponding to graves were found. And so those 320 blips, based on our research in comparison to other sites, would make the Fishkill Supply Depot burial ground the single largest concentration of Revolutionary War soldiers in a burial ground known to man. Regrettably, the owner still retains possession of the land with hopes of developing it. As recently as May this year, an additional archaeological examination was paid for by the owner under the direction of New York State's Office of Historic Preservation. And the objective of that dig in May of 2013 was to determine the outer limit of the burial ground relative to the rest of the property. And in talking with the owner afterwards, he explained to me that his feeling is if he could just isolate the burial ground, he could separate it from the rest of his acreage and develop on the rest of the acreage and leave the burial ground intact. But from our group's perspective, that just won't hold, because for those of you who've been to the site and have taken the tour as part of events that we've held, you know that the remaining 10 acres really are a time capsule of the Revolution, in that they contain other significant ruins that were discovered in previous archaeological examinations. I mentioned the officers' stables. I've walked the ground myself, and I've seen what I believe to be, and what have been described to me as posts in the ground from the original Van Wyck family vineyards that predated the Revolution. So what we have in Fishkill is a site, 10.5 acres, that has the potential of being, in my view, and I think in the view even of the Dutchess County historian, a potential Jamestown site. If it could be saved and studied, interpreted, and exhibited, it could really be a one-of-a-kind, and could hold unique clues to the logistical and supply functions of the Revolution that really have never been studied. So what is our group doing about it? Well, very quickly, we're doing a number of things. Of course, we're talking with politicians, we're partnering with conservation groups that have deep pockets to save land. But events like these, outreach events like these, really hold the clue, because our feeling is that the larger portion of the public that knows about the site, the less they would stand for it being desecrated or developed on. And so the more people we can reach, even in 1s and 2s and 3s and 4s, the better. In order to convey our message clearly, we're trying to bring life to the burial ground. Now, if you go there today, and keep in mind it's private property, but if you were to go to the Maya Cafe today, walk north across Van Wyck Lake Road, and look at the piece of property, you'll probably see some flags that we placed there. But it largely is just a pasture with trees grown over it. You're not going to find headstones or markers or anything identifying those 320 or more patriots. So what our group has done is we've gone back into the muster rolls from the Revolution, principally using the website Fold 3, and in a brute force research effort, we've tried to identify units that were serving in Fishkill, guarding the supply depot, and look at the monthly muster rolls and determine which patriots are listed as died or buried in Fishkill. And I'm pleased to announce that as of today, we have the names of 86 First Patriots who are in that burial ground somewhere, that if it could be saved, and with some luck and some DNA testing, maybe we could connect the names to the actual bodies. I want to thank everybody for coming. Todd, would you like to come up and give some final remarks? But that really concludes my presentation. Outside, after the thank you. Outside, we're going to have a table of information. We have a great website. We do a lot of events, outreach events. We clean up the highway. We do research. If anybody feels compelled to volunteer or even just learn about what we're doing, please visit our website, contact us. I can hand out business cards. The more people who know and get involved, the greater chances we'll be able to save this thing. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Lance. I would like to conclude tonight's program by inviting all of our speakers back up on stage for a question and answer period. Professors Birch and Kelly have microphones available, so if you do have a question, please signal to them or to me, and any pertinent topic about tonight's talk. Although I would do ask, please keep your questions to the point. There will be more time for conversation at the reception afterwards in Ritz Lounge.
On the west side of the river shadowed the British as they went up the Hudson River to burn Kingston. I'd just like to know what those people did, if someone could elaborate. What did General Clinton do, and what did General Putnam do in regard to that British force going up the Hudson River?
It's actually quite an involved question. There was a whole series of troop movements. Had General Putnam essentially on the east side of the river, General Clinton with a force of about 1,000 to 1,500 on the west side of the river. And they're trying to coordinate and communicate. Communication, as I said, becomes a real bugaboo because you've got British spies, you've got troops moving here, there, and everywhere, and George Clinton is at Fort Montgomery when it's attacked by the British, he and his brother, James Clinton. It gets really confusing because just with the names involved, James Clinton in command at Fort Montgomery, or Fort Clinton, George Clinton in command at Fort Montgomery, the British commander, Lord Clinton, and his father, by the way, was George Clinton, who was also governor of New York, like George Clinton was. So communication gets really messed up. This became dreadfully difficult for one of the spies who was captured, Daniel Taylor, who was captured by Americans wearing red coats. He was on his way to bring a message from British General Clinton to General Burgoyne, and he encounters redcoats. Well, I figured these are my people, you know. Well, they weren't his people. He asked them who's their commander, and they said Clinton. He said, okay, slam dunk. These are my people. No. So there you have the whole incident with the silver bullet, with the message that he chucks down, says, oops, I'm in the wrong place. Clinton recounts how his surgeon administered to Daniel Taylor a strong tartar emetic aimed to retrieve the bullet. And they retrieved the bullet. And Daniel Taylor saw the bullet and he popped it back down and swallowed it again. So they said, well, next time we're going to remove it, we're going to use our surgical approach. So he submitted to the tartar emetic again, put forth the bullet containing the message. Daniel Taylor was hanged as a spy. George Clinton, Governor George Clinton, took Daniel Taylor along with him as he and his troops moved from Fort Montgomery on up to try to get to Kingston to mount a defense against the British attack that he knew full well was going to be occurring. General Putnam was really kind of frozen on the east side because the British launched a feint towards Peekskill. So here was an attack going towards Peekskill. They had landed earlier in the year and burned the stores at Continental Village. And here, when they're actually meaning to attack Forts Montgomery and Clinton, they launch a feint. Well, poor General Putnam is sitting there and says, well, they're coming at me. I got to hold my troops here. So he wasn't able to reinforce the troops at Fort Montgomery. So all for about 2 weeks' time, as the British stayed in the Hudson River, Clinton and Putnam are just doing this dance, trying to coordinate and trying to set up an effective defense. And ultimately, the British just withdrew from the river, abandoned Fort Montgomery, blew it up, and that was that. But communication was incredibly difficult at the time.
Was that force coming up the Hudson River ever engaged by either of those?
Yeah, I don't think so. Jim might know better than I on that. I think they were just always missing, and the British sailing past them and sailing past in the other direction, and not able to engage.
And that's pretty close to, I think, what happened. About 5,000 troops are finally rallied to the south of Albany. So essentially, Sir Henry Clinton's going to see that there's no future in trying to go north. He hears about the surrender at Saratoga, and William Howe asked for the troops to come to Pennsylvania. So it all kind of peters out. But if you look at the ship's logs for the British ships that actually go up the river, you'll see that the Americans do fire upon it occasionally with musket fire, and down around New Windsor actually fire cannon fire at the ships. So there is a little bit of plinking at this force along the way. But the only major battles are fought at Fort Montgomery, Clinton, and then of course up at Saratoga.
In regards to the burial ground in Fishkill, how public is the access to get in there?
Well, it's private property. Whenever our group does any sorts of events on there, we get the consent, the express consent of the owner. I think in general terms, he's come to grips with not developing on top of the burial ground. At this point, it's the rest of the land that's really contentious. Nevertheless, it's still in peril. But you can go down there. You can drive. If you know where the Maya Cafe is, you could park there or park at the McDonald's and walk across the street. You know, just be mindful and respectful that there are soldiers in the ground there, but it's basically wide open. Yeah.
Behind the depot, pretty much, how there's that big mountain and there's like a chain of mountains back there.
Yes.
Have they found anything back there regarding like bodies of patriots and whatnot?
Well, I think there are, and maybe Jim can add to this, but you know, the system of travel from the Hudson River over to the Fishkill Supply Depot involved going up the Fishkill Ridge and up the Fishkill Ridge across the mountain tops and then descending into Fishkill on those mountains that you're talking about. And there were Revolutionary War huts on top of the mountains, not only for the soldiers who were garrisoned there as lookouts, but also as part of the signal fires. So you can only imagine that there are probably bodies scattered here and there, but not in any formal concentration like what's in Fishkill, as far as I know.
Rich Mike can add to this too. The only other group that I'm aware of is somewhere around Fishkill Creek was the campsite of the Corps of Invalids. Those were soldiers who had gotten sick or grown old in the service of the Continental Army and were in a special corps doing guard duty and that kind of thing. Somewhere over there is that. Also near the Melzinga Memorial, right on Route 9 there's a quarry site that unfortunately pretty much destroyed the southern redoubts, the area of the hospital in the south, and maybe even that camp. So I'm afraid the quarrying operation probably has obliterated almost everything that's left of what happened in that particular area.
Just to add to that, Jim's talking about close to the Dutchess-Putnam County line along Route 9. You know, if you leave from the McDonald's driving southbound, you come through a very prominent S-curve. And at the bottom of that S-curve, it's hard to tell because it's kind of off to the right, but there is a DAR marker for where the lower barracks was for the Fishkill Supply Depot.
Could you just tell us how far north it extended, the boundary line for the depot? Like where Route 52 goes east and west, did it expand that far north?
You know, the records reflect that it was, you know, approximately 2 to 3 miles south of the village of Fishkill, which would put it right where we think it is, where the Van Wyck homestead is. Now, there were some other ruins and artifacts collected north of I-84 in the vicinity of what was the Holiday Inn, which is now the Ramada. But we think, based on the records, the main fort that we describe as the depot was south of 84 and south of the Van Wyck homestead.
Okay, thank you.
Other than the work that was done on the burial ground itself, have there been any other systemic surveys of the area using modern technology that can identify with more precision what might be there? And how do you relate that to the existing collection of maps and documents that would guide such an effort if it were not already completed?
There's been a series of archaeological excavations and studies on different tracks and portions of the depot site. going back at least to 1958. Many of the sites which were initially sampled have been destroyed, bulldozed, developed. So there's been some systematic survey of the area where we have located the burials. There has been some testing to adjacent areas, but as far as a real wholesale systematic archaeological reconnaissance, no, that hasn't really been done on the remaining tracts. Did that answer your question? Okay.
And let me just add, from a preservation effort, in addition to the 10.5 acres that's sandwiched between the Hess Station and the Maya Cafe, there's also relatively undeveloped land that was part of the Fishkill Supply Depot. We estimate about 6 to 7 additional acres of untouched, undisturbed land to the east of the Van Wyck homestead. The town of Fishkill put a pump house along Snook Road, which is immediately next to the Van Wyck property. On the other side of that, the eastbound side of that, the 6 to 7 acres is owned by a church operating in Beacon that originally had hopes of developing it, but just hasn't been able to do it. And of the National Register of Historic Places overlay, the footprint overlay from 1973 and 74, like I said, about 6 or 7 acres of that land falls in there, and to the best of my knowledge has not been studied like the 10.5 acres that's south of the Hess Station.
Hi, I have a question about Kingston. Hi, I'm over here. For Mr. Doring?
Yeah.
You said that the British burned every house but one. Hi.
Thank you.
I was wondering if that house has been saved. Is it a historic site?
It's a privately owned residence in uptown Kingston on Wall Street, known as the Van Steenberg House. And it has a very nice, huge bronze plaque upon it saying, this was the only house, not burned. I think more interestingly enough, there's a lot of speculation as to why that house wasn't burned. And nobody has really given a credible answer. One account, a sort of 19th century historian, relates that this was the house of a young lady who had made the acquaintance of some of the British officers at a party in New York City, and boy, weren't they surprised to see her when they showed up at Kingston. Say, you're not going to burn my house, are you, big boy? There's another account that says that there was a Tory named Lefferts, who upon the British approach to Kingston, Lefferts went out and greeted the troops and said, "Hey, I just got a phone call from Saratoga. I just received news. Your boy Burgoyne ain't going to be going any further." So this was apparently the first news that the British had of Burgoyne's imminent demise. They decided they'd burn the city anyway. But apparently this house is attributed as being occupied by Lefferts. So he, although it was in the Van Steenberg family, he may have been quartering there. So we don't really know, why, but it was the Van Steenberg house. It's a great house. If you get a chance to come up to Kingston and take a hike and do a little walking tour, Friends of Historic Kingston do a great walking tour program on most weekends, and you might really enjoy that. Good.
I think we have time for one more question, but if you do have questions, we will have a reception afterwards right across the lobby in the Ritz Lounge. So one more question, please, and then we can continue any conversations that you have right across the hall. And there's food, all right, free food. So, okay, we have.
Sorry.
Thank you. This was excellent, really informative. I'm very curious about how the same owner could commission 3 destructive archaeological excavations in the same area. That seems like very weird oversight from the state.
That's a good question because I'm not a state official. we were encouraged because the owner seeking the approval of the state to do the digs, I think, was proof positive that he realizes that he's under the microscope in terms of the significance of the site. We were also surprised that the state agreed, but it just shows you how sacred our country holds the rights of private property owners, quite honestly. The owner's contention has always been that maybe the bodies that are there on his property are either Van Wyck family bodies as part of a family cemetery from that era, or some other inexplainable cemetery. But we know that based on the artifacts that were collected, it had all the trappings of the Revolution in terms of the buttons and the fibers and the coffin nails. And so we know it's the Revolutionary War burial ground that we always thought was there. One positive note is that as a function of this most recent archaeological dig, Marilyn, our group, almost all of our board members, got a chance to go out and physically meet the property owner for the first time. As an out-of-towner, he doesn't get to Fishkill that often, but to see him and talk to him and establish a little bit of a bridgehead in terms of a dialogue has been huge for us, and that dialogue continues today. So. I just want to take this opportunity once again to thank the panelists who spoke tonight, to thank Todd Wilmot and Dutchess Community College for setting this up. I have a small presentation to give each of them. They're now official members of our group. This is our T-shirt, which I'd like to give to each of the speakers, minus one. I may have to get an extra one for the pinch hitter that came up. Rich? Thank you. And by the way, Rich and Jim are advisors, advisory board members to our group. Joanna, thank you. Thank you for speaking.
Give that one to Nicole. You know where I live.
We'd be glad to deliver to Florida.
She's getting on the plane tomorrow, so.
She can take that to Florida. Give that to Florida. You can take care of Colonel Johnson.
Yeah, thank you. And this is for you, Todd.
Thank you.
And I have one additional gift for Todd. I had a good fortune of traveling to Europe on a vacation with my family this summer. And it's not lost on me or my family that Todd is really not an American history professor. He's a medieval history professor. And we were able to visit a quite remarkable medieval site in France. And so we got him a little token. So you can open this privately at home. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, you got it.
Thank you very much, Lance. So again, thank you all for coming, and please feel free to walk across the lobby for our reception. Thank you very much.